Guardiola's structured approach versus Ancelotti's free-flowing football promised another classic encounter, and they did not disappoint, with a 3-3 draw being blessed by several world-class strikes. But what were the tactical plans of both sides? Let's begin with City on the ball. When City were looking to build from deep, Madrid were in an aggressive 4-4-2, ready to press the centre-backs, with the wingers backing up the press and cutting out any easy outlet options. With limited space deep and in the midfield, City tried to make the pitch bigger, and this was by having Haaland remain extremely high up the pitch on the goal kicks where there is no offside rule, which would naturally force the Madrid backline to drop a little bit deeper. City did have success with the longer ball into Haaland, but this was rare, as throughout the match Rudiger had the upper hand in this 1-versus-1 duel. And it is interesting that Haaland didn't choose to instead position himself on the non-natural centre-back. City looked to take advantage of the secondary effect of Haaland making the pitch bigger, pushing Stones more into the midfield, so they could look to overload Real there. However, the fullbacks were key, as well as the wingers, in preventing this overload, as they had to position themselves to be both ready to press the winger or the midfielder, depending on where City got the ball. In open play, Real could defend in a modified 4-4-2 that looked like this, with Bellingham ready to back up the press with Vinicius. And Kroos and Camavinga could be aggressive on closing down the men in the midfield to prevent City having easy access into these regions. And these central pressing traps worked well, and Bernardo Silva was often on the receiving end of this, and where he's usually ultra secure in possession, he was dispossessed in a few dangerous positions. For the most part, City did build up in their 3-box-3 shape. However, it was much more fluid than usual, with players not being stuck rigidly in their positions, and the midfield in particular could adapt their shape as needed. If Kroos and Camavinga were on the deeper men, it now gave City the 2-versus-1 advantage in these zones, and we saw them getting onto the ball much more. And if Camavinga was to spring forward to try and stop the progressive play, on several occasions we saw Foden and Kovacic have the 2-versus-1, and early in the match they were able to get between the lines fairly easily, but not able to make the most of these situations. It should be noted that in this shape, Kovacic looked uncomfortable in these higher positions, as he prefers to be deep controlling the play. And as a result, as the match went on, we saw Stones instead being the man who pushed higher up, allowing Kovacic to remain deep. Real, of course, adapted to City's attempt to overload the midfield. And Valverde was key to this, as he rarely defended out wide, and neither did Rodrigo, with the main role of Valverde being to pick up a midfield man. With City primarily attacking down the right-hand side, what was interesting is that the Real back four was not obsessed with being compact, and both Carvajal and Mendy in particular could be fairly man-oriented, leaving this giant space between the fullback and the centre-back. Traditionally, this would spell massive danger, as the half-space run would be on for City. However, Toni Kroos was hyper-disciplined in this encounter, dropping extremely deep with Foden to prevent that half-space run, or if the Englishman looked to get on the ball, he was always in close pursuit. But of course, Kroos wasn't always successful with this, particularly in the second half when Stones had a lot more freedom to push high up the pitch, as once again, City's box midfield was not hyper-fixated in their shape, so Stones often made the third man run into the half space, looking to get on the ball or create the room. And we saw this in the lead-up to City's goal, as Stones in the half space draws Toni Kroos, giving Foden some rare space to get his shot off. As the match progressed, we saw Foden and Silva rotate a lot more, to firstly allow Silva to have more control in the middle, and Foden to have more isolations against his man. This season, particularly when Walker was playing, we'd seen Pep much more willing to have Walker overlap to allow him to have more men in these central zones. But of course that is not Akanji's natural game. But in the second half, we did see him move higher up on the right-hand side in order to allow both Foden and Silva in these zones to increase that overload against Kroos to look to get into more threatening positions. And these right-side overloads would drag Real across, freeing up the switch into Grealish to then isolate Carvajal, leading to some menacing moments. Madrid, however, looked lethal on the transition, led by Vinicius, Bellingham and Rodrigo. City's fluid midfield meant that at times they had a double pivot, but as discussed, Stones could be higher up, meaning on more than one occasion Rodri was isolated. Real was so effective on the break because we did see them look to directly go long on more than one occasion, and the threat of that long ball meant that the centre-backs had to keep in mind that Vinicius could just run in behind. What this now meant is that Vinicius also had the freedom to drop deeper into the midfield, and the centre-backs were always too slow and never physical enough on the man to disrupt the build-up play from Real. So we saw him receive in plenty of space, play out to Rodrigo, giving Vinicius the option to run in behind and receive, or run much more centrally and give Rodrigo the opportunity to have the 1-versus-1 against Akanji. And either way, Real were happy in these scenarios, as we saw for their second goal. But what were Real looking to do in attacking possession? Real's attacking shape was very much a 4-4-2, with Bellingham often looking to join Vinicius. City were looking to be aggressive in their own press, going man-to-man with Kroos and Camavinga, making play into the midfield extremely difficult. Real could look to take advantage of this by staggering those pivots and creating a gaping hole in the midfield for either Vinicius or Bellingham to drop into, and this would subsequently drag a centre-back out of position, once again creating opportunities for the running power of their front three against City's slow back four. But despite the potential space in the midfield, that was not Real's major ploy. Whether on the transition or in control possession, their plan from the beginning was to go long as often as possible. And City's high line only helped this, as Vinicius, Bellingham, Rodrigo, and even Carvajal at times were more than happy to look to make runs to be found in behind. And again, City's defense looked sloppy on occasion. When Real were in high possession, Mendy, but particularly Carvajal, looked to hold the width, with the goal being to make the pitch as wide as possible and force City's defense to be uncompact. The secondary effect of this was it would allow the likes of Valverde more into the midfield zone, whilst Rodrigo could become a third forward alongside Vinicius and Bellingham, looking to create overloads in those regions. Because of the danger of the potential overload in these zones, both Akanji and Gvardiol would still defend extremely narrow, so Grealish and Silva had to be extremely disciplined in assisting the defense, meaning the defensive shape could at times look like a bit of a 6-2-2. With City forced into this shape, Real had options, as they could still overload the citizens in Zone 14 and use combination play to get into dangerous regions. But it also meant that they could overload one side of the pitch fairly easily and then look to create opportunities for the switch to the far side. And the Real opener has shades of this. Initially we see Real overload the left-hand side, and Carvajal wide forces Grealish deep and wide. Camavinga receives, and now Grealish moves into the midfield to press him, and Carvajal is the free man. There's an overload in Zone 14, meaning that Real can afford to have runners, which creates space for Camavinga to come in and have the shot. Perfectly poised for the second match, but I want to know who you think will go through to the next round. Drop it down below. For the manager tactical score, Ancelotti's transitional approach was well executed, with some poor finishing letting him down, meaning he earns a 7, while Pep earns a 5, as City looked wide open on the transition. But what are your thoughts? Drop them down below. Check out the last video looking at the classic between Bayern and Arsenal.